And now, please welcome the Atlantic's Nicholas Thompson.
Wow. What a wonderful, full audience. Good morning. Thanks for being here on time. Thanks for being here for our early sessions. I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm CEO of The Atlantic, and I am delighted to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Atlantic Festival. This will be our first session of the Ideas Stage. So The Atlantic was founded in 1857. That's spring. A bunch of people, 3 names, came together: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wonderful intellectuals, and they came together with a goal: to create an indispensable magazine for readers who are deeply engaged with the issues of the day, to help Americans understand what they call the American ideal, and to help the country try to figure itself out, to stave off the Civil War, if possible, to help bring about abolition. There are a lot of magazines that kind of run away from their histories or maybe step back a little bit. We do our best to try to live up to those ideals. And so for 167 years, we've published the most urgent essays. We've operated one of the founders' most cherished beliefs: to challenge assumptions and to pursue truth without regard for party or clique. As you can imagine, this is a pretty important issue right now. So, thank you for being here. This will be the full expression of the Atlantic's journalism. You will see our amazing writers on stage. You'll see our ideas brought to life. You'll hear from leaders across industries. They will unpack consequential issues. They will talk about innovation. They will talk about politics. They will talk about everything. They'll talk about the state of the U.S. economy. And they will talk about the future of American democracy. Before we begin, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to particularly thank those of you who are subscribers. This year, we reached 1 million subscribers for the first time in our history. That's wonderful. I also want to thank the underwriters who have made this festival possible. So, our presenting level underwriters: Eli Lilly and Company, Microsoft, Southern Company, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Our supporting level underwriters: Allstate, Evernorth Health Services, and our contributing level underwriters: Arnold Ventures, Calm, Genentech, Goldman Sachs, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Uber, and Visit Seattle. Our hope is that you'll be informed by the conversations you hear this morning. We ask you share your thoughts about the program on social media. Hope the Wi-Fi is working. Use the hashtag TAF24. Thank you so much, and enjoy the show.
Please welcome to the stage political strategist Kellyanne Conway. And here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Tim Alberta.
Good morning. Welcome to my festival. We're batting lead off here. I hope we don't screw it up for everyone else. Kellyanne, it's a lot of pressure.
Let's do it.
Are you up to it?
Good morning,
okay,
everyone.
So, Kellyanne Conway, for those of you who don't know, long before she became the first woman to be campaign manager to a winning presidential campaign, before she became senior counselor to the President of the United States, Kellyanne was known to most of us as a pollster, as a Republican pollster. And pollsters, in my experience, really love softball questions. So I'm going to kick off the 2024 Atlantic Festival with a softball question for you, Kellyanne. If the election were held today, who wins?
That's so easy. If the election were held today, I think President Trump would win, because he has an advantage in the 7 swing states right now over Vice President Harris, and particularly in the swing states that get him a couple different paths to 270, which is the magic number. I think Vice President Harris, for the last 2 months plus, has been winning back a lot of the core Democratic constituencies that were elusive to President Biden at the top of the ticket. So she is doing much better than he was among young people, among women, among men and women in the suburbs, a little bit more among African Americans, basically the same among Hispanics. So and union households. So she's starting to get and continues to solidify what you would think of as the typical take for the Democratic presidential nominee. The question here on out is, what will the travel schedule look like in those swing states for each of them? It is the 7 swing states. I totally agree with everybody's assessment that it's North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. What's interesting about that, Tim, is that there are states that President Obama carried twice in 08 and 12, well over 50% of the vote. Florida, Ohio, Iowa, firmly in the Trump camp, aren't even swing states anymore. On the other side of the ledger, there are new swing states like Arizona and Georgia, which were not thought of as swing states until very recently. So even for those of us who do this for a living, there's been a jumbling of the electoral map. But I would remind us all, we already know this, but to hear the stats really puts it into sharp relief. So 2016, President Trump wins with 77,000 votes across Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
77,744.
There you go. Who's counting?
Yeah.
And then in 2020, of course, President Biden, 44,000 votes, and the swing state in common is Wisconsin, but then you have Georgia and Arizona added to that. Why is this relevant? In 2020, ladies and gentlemen, we had 155,500,000 votes, a 10% increase from 4 years earlier, a huge uptick huge explosion in early voting and mail-in balloting because we had more people voting over more time in more ways than ever before, given we were in the middle of a pandemic and the polls are being opened up in very different ways. You can do it by mail, you can do it on the drop box, et cetera, in person. Other people can do the ballot for you, which is what I was doing for my mom at the time, for example. So it's
You were harvesting?
it was it was legal in New Jersey.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, but anyway, well, she harvested me, so I figured I'd harvest her back.
No.
Anyhow, so that was a very unusual election. What we're seeing right now is I think so much of this is going to be the same, meaning a tactical trench warfare technical election, which is who has the better ground game, who has the better get out the vote program, not just enraging voters, but engaging them and getting them to the polls. And so the noisiest people right now, whether they want to talk about a rally or a debate or the candidates or a TV appearance, the noisiest people right now are already decided. The 5% who remain are very fascinating to me. They don't look like the rest of the electorate. They told the New York Times Siena College pollsters in that explosive poll that came out 2 days before the debate, Tim, that 0% of them said they're going to vote on character. 2% of them said abortion was the top issue. That's very different than the electorate overall. But if you're a character or abortion immigration voter, you're all set. So it's that 5% who, and they are dug in. Here's the question about them, and this is why I think is decisive in this election. The second question for the undecided voters is for whom to vote, Harris or Trump. The first question is whether to bother at all. And for some of them, I think they will be conscientious objectors. I mean, the idea, my 2 grandmothers were born before women had the right to vote. The idea that their combined 6 daughters would never have voted, and they would have admitted that to you, they would have felt ashamed to say, I'm not voting, after their mothers couldn't do it until much later in their lives. They would have felt ashamed growing up in the 60s, 70s, to not do that. And yet now people use it as a badge of courage. I don't like either. I'm not going to encourage this. My vote doesn't count. I don't feel included.
Is your sense that after this explosive jump in raw turnout that we saw from 16 to 20, that we will see a drop off from 20 to 24?
Maybe, although the enthusiasm is there on both sides, certainly. You know, Kamala Harris does have a new energy and enthusiasm, certainly in base and base plus. And Trump's is not just base. If it were just base, he wouldn't be competitive. It's base plus. It's his ability, I think, to expand demographically and geographically his reach into voter blocks that did not support him in 2016 or 2020 and typically would either vote for a Democrat or not at all. President Trump's best last mile of wire, if you will be among the voters this time who say they're likely to vote but did not vote in 2020. So he does very well with them. The big question is, how do you get them to vote? If they weren't presidential voters in the highest turnout we've ever had, how do you get them to vote? And I think what's fascinating to me is that the current incumbent, Vice President Harris, wants to run as the new face, fresh face, insurgent, non-incumbent change maker. And President Trump is running as the insurgent with an incumbent's record. He wants everybody to remember what it was like when he was in office, particularly when it comes to no new wars and the economy, particularly 2019. She wants to sort of start from here and say, this is my vision moving forward. So it's a fascinating construct.
So the one thing that both campaigns agree on is that we are sort of, you use the phrase trench warfare, that we're sort of back to where we began in many ways. If this was a campaign in 3 phases, the first phase was 18 months ago, where both the Biden and Trump world looked at this as sort of a coin flip, and they were going to be fighting over about 150,000 voters across 15 counties or so. And then we entered phase 2, where Biden declined sharply and Trump rose accordingly, and then they pushed him out of the race. And now we're in phase 3, which both campaigns think we're sort of back to the trench warfare phase. I want to talk about that in just a minute. Before we do, we've had some seismic events. We thought 2016 was the craziest election of our lifetimes. Is my mic on? Sure it is. No? Hello? Oh, there we are. Okay. We thought 2016 was the craziest election of our lifetimes with Access Hollywood and Comey and Clinton investigation, and then 20 with COVID. But already in this cycle, we've had the President of the United States pushed out by his party. We've had an assassination attempt on the President, potentially 2 assassination attempts on the President, and more to come potentially in these next 50 days. Who knows what's in store. But another big moment is this debate a couple of weeks ago. And I have to ask you, who do you blame more for that performance, Donald Trump or the people who prepared him?
You're assuming that the country absorbs that debate the way you do, or the way anybody in this room would.
Metrics show that most of the country did.
Well, I think that it was a high-risk, high-reward prospect for Vice President Harris, more than President Trump, because it was his 7th or 9th presidential debate. We haven't heard much from her, so I think it was a very big moment for her. And she met the moment in many ways. Obviously, she said things that have since been fact-checked. I think she was fact-checked in real time by our troops who are serving honorably, God bless them, abroad, and other things. But I think for President Trump, he should look at it as part of his batting average. In other words, it goes into the whole factory of appearances for him. He is on long-form podcasts. He does rallies a couple times a week. He goes on television shows. He did that just yesterday. Everything I just said, he did yesterday. And he should look at it as part of his batting average. I think taking too much time to respond to what she was saying, I think that was very maybe alarming and off-putting, which is, wow, you're bringing up all the greatest hits. Like, we have cable news for this. We thought it was going to be a conversation about vision. But I would say this. Hi. Oh, thank you. Hello.
Oh, sorry about that.
I won't sing. Actually, okay. So this is what I would say. For the polls haven't budged that much. Some have, but in the swing states, they really haven't. The underlying fundamentals are the same, and I think it is because of that. And I think for Vice President Harris, she's had a big moment every month since she's gotten in. So July, she becomes the nominee, big moment. August, she has a convention, big moment. September, she had a debate. These things are won or lost on what you do in between those big moments. I personally think we need another debate, because I'm a big fan of democracy, and I love the fact that people have an opportunity to see the candidates shoulder to shoulder, responding to each other, responding to the moderator's questions, and taking an opportunity, even when not asked, to either review their record, contrast with the other person, and give us that vision thing. People in this country are suffering. There's no question about it.
But Donald Trump did not seem keen to have another debate. Now, you talk with him frequently. Have you told him that you'd like him to debate again?
I did tell him that.
And what does he say?
He said, oh, you're in the minority. I said, well, I'm not in the minority of people who tell you what you need to know and not what you want to hear, which would put me in the majority. And I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, except that he said, I put out my Truth Social, Kelly, and he said, when you're a boxer, the boxer wins the fight, you don't need another one. And I said, but it's not that simple. You want the other opportunity, because the first debate, it was told anyone, anytime, anywhere, I think. And the anytime ended up being June 27th, which is so super early. It's before the 2 conventions. And had the first debate been September 10th against Joe Biden, I think you'd be stuck with him as the nominee, certainly. Be a very different ballgame. So the first one happened super early, changed the dynamic completely. President Trump has said that publicly. He has said, I think I knocked him out too early.
He's very unhappy about it.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm not going to characterize his mood or his. He does that for us, so I don't need to do that for him. But And then the second one, if you agree to have ABC and its moderators, then you are potentially walking into a network which unbiased reporting says is 84% negative towards him and about 85% positive towards her. Those are just the facts. Now, you can work around that. You can say, gee, you just said young people care most about climate change. I don't know, I'm looking at the stats, and a lot of them care about, 23% told pollsters last week they don't think they'll have children because they like their financial freedom and it's too expensive. They can't add somebody to the household payroll, a kid, a spouse. They care about that too. They care about many things. Let's stop slicing and dicing everybody into be a monolithic voters.
Go back to something you said a minute ago about the people who tell him what he wants to hear versus what he needs to hear. Because
Needs to know,
right. Because I have one more debate question. Why was Laura Loomer on his plane heading to that debate?
I prefer Laura Trump. That would be my favorite Laura to be around him. She's doing a great job at the RNC. I don't know, and I'm not here to criticize his campaign team. I don't do that. What I'm here to say is that I think that any one moment, like our shock absorbers are so thick in this country now for so many reasons. You just mentioned a bunch of them that have only really happened in the last 70 days, 80 days. Tim, I think our shock absorbers are so thick that there's no one moment or incident that people say, aha. And lots of folks, in fairness, have, and people that we both know very well.
When you ran a campaign, Kellyanne,
yeah, but
for
we
president,
had, you know what?
Would you have let Laura Loomer on the plane?
No, because people, I don't know her. I don't know that I've ever been in the same room with her. People have shown me what she has said. I'm not a big fan of Twitter. I'm not a big fan of, I just don't live on social media. I'm not willing to live online. I'm willing to live offline with all of you here. It just tastes, looks, smells, and is better. So I didn't know this person. I know, so when I learned more about her and what she was saying, including to my 19-year-old daughter, it's unacceptable, and I've pushed back on that. And I've had a conversation or two with the president since that I won't reveal, and I like what I heard. I will just say that. And I don't really care what she says. I don't care what people screaming on social media say. It doesn't really matter. It matters to me if they're anti-this or anti-that, and I know that they don't reflect the principle. So no, she wouldn't have been there.
If in fact she doesn't reflect the principle, if we're sure.
If she doesn't. The things I've seen, I don't understand why people feel the need to scream and complain and bellyache online as much as everybody seems to do. And can I just say something else about that? We are allowed in this country, I think I'm just old, if not old-fashioned, we're allowed in this country to have an unexpressed thought. We're allowed. And so, that's why most of what I do and most of my conversations are private, certainly what I do for my clients. But I think President Trump sees this election as the trench warfare technical election, but also one of ideas. And that's why if you asked him about that debate, he'll tell you, I said, well, you're going to do all these great things. You've had 3.5 years. In fact, you're there right now. She can get on air. We know she's there because she's Vice President Harris. She flies around on Air Force too. And just trying to distance herself from all of that, I don't think is great policy or great politics. But, him saying to her about Afghanistan and the economy and the Green New Deal, I think he got plenty in there.
Here's what I want to know about this trench warfare campaign. If in fact that's what President Trump believes, it's certainly what his campaign folks believe. This campaign, as I have documented in my own published reporting, has intentionally diverted millions and millions and millions of dollars away from a field program, a traditional ground game, in these key battleground states, in these key counties that we've been discussing, and diverted that money toward this very sort of amorphous election integrity program. And when I talk to people inside the campaign, they're frustrated, they're exasperated, and they're not entirely sure what that money is going to do when, at the same time, people on the ground in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia are calling Trump HQ on a daily basis, reading the Riot Act, saying we have no manpower, no resources on the ground here. So if, in fact, this is a trench warfare campaign, why on earth have they made this decision to effectively abandon much of the ground game in the pursuit of this election integrity program?
You're characterizing it in a way I don't think they would. And if people in the campaign are talking to you respectfully instead of other people in the campaign, they should not be on the campaign. You got to tell the folks you're working with first and foremost.
Well, I think they have in many cases.
Well, maybe. I mean, I see a little too many stories these days of course anonymously sourced always, that the campaign is poised to win and is disciplined, but the candidate's not. So maybe that's coming from the same people that are talking to you. They shouldn't be saying that. They should be too busy to do that. But look, this is what I would say, that there's a lot more money this time. I mean, we had no money, and I would say necessity was the mother of invention. I think the best Trump is the 2016 Trump: hunger, swagger, underdog, underestimated, 50% television ads, 50% digital ads, but overlaid with the money he has now in 2024, which is significant, and the 4-year presidential record. So I think in those ways that Trump 2024 can be the best Trump candidacy of all. And I know Susie Wiles and other people in the campaign, they're doing a fabulous job trying to meet the moment of 2024, meaning here's who our principal is. He wants to go out and do those rallies. He wants to do the long form podcast. He wants to meet with the people. He wants to do these policy videos back at Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster and put them out. He wants to be on social media. But they also are meeting the moment of how many people are getting their primary sources of news and information through social media and digital. And that is not something, we took a chance in 2016 because we didn't have any money. It paid off. Google and Facebook will tell you that there were weeks and days where the Trump campaign was the #1 buyer of those ads over Hillary Clinton's campaign because she had so much money. They were doing TV ads. Now, 2020, I'm very critical of the 2020 campaign. I wrote about it in my memoir, Here's the Deal. Simon & Schuster is putting it out in paperback soon, right ahead of this election.
Save the book plugs for the end.
Yeah.
Okay, let's.
You want this book because a lot ended up being true. But I talk about how to win. But in 2020, the Trump campaign spent $1.6 billion. And I feel that they did prove many times that the fastest way to make a small fortune is to have a very large one and waste most of it. All these TV ads, an $11.5 million ad during the Super Bowl.
Well,
you want that money at the end to run
Yes.
the ads in Wisconsin and Michigan for whatever else, civil unrest, George Floyd's murder, a global pandemic. I got it.
But to be clear, I'm talking with a Republican operative in Michigan running a very competitive congressional race. And this time, 2 years ago, in that district, they had 20 paid people on the ground between the RNC, the Michigan Republican
But there
Party.
are outside groups doing that now. You've got America First Work, you have Turning Point, they've got money.
People who have
And I
no
will say
track
this
record
about
of
the RNC.
no track record of running an effective ground game.
I will say this about
Charlie
the RNC.
Kirk has never turned out a vote that
They
we're aware
have,
of.
I don't know that that's true. I think you're just, not being nice. He's built an empire there, not just with young people now,
He
but
promised to deliver
actually-
all 4 statewide races in Arizona in 2022, and they lost all 4 statewide races.
I'll let him speak for himself and what they're doing this time. But here are the metrics that I've
I don't
seen.
think he's coming to the Atlantic.
Here are the, I do. I show up.
I wish you would.
But I will say this. I think that I have seen all the metrics, and many of them are public. Just learning how to invest in what I call now the non-sexy parts of politics. So not the exciting ads and not the candidate shaking your hand and signing a hat or showing up to a festival like this, but actually doing the work you need to do to make sure that the people feel engaged and included and seen and heard, and that you become a resource. It's so easy to be a rebel. You have to be a resource to these voters. And I do know America First Work and Turning Point and many other groups. RNC, Laura Trump talks about this often. The numbers, that the voter rolls that have been cleaned, some of the decisions that have come down. For example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court came out with this decision last week. You have to have a return address or we're not going to count your ballot. That is new.
And I'm just telling you, though, that anecdote I was sharing a minute ago.
Why isn't she way ahead? I mean, back to my point, I think the fundamentals still favor him. She certainly can win. There's no doubt. It's going to be I think it's a tight election. But then everything you're saying, the fundamentals should absolutely favor her because the Democrats have a complete machine when it comes to the turnout. And she's doing better politically.
Well, it's often
electorally
hard
among some
to
of
tell
those
until
groups.
Election Day how many
That's
points
the thing.
that machine is worth.
Sure,
Right, so in the
that's
state of
the thing.
Wisconsin, which has probably the best state party on the Democratic side of the country, their ground game has traditionally been worth 2.5, 3 points, maybe even 3.5 points. And if the Trump people in those states, the county chairs, if they're complaining that they have no resources and that they're totally outgunned on the ground, and if this is trench warfare, coming down to another margin of 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, 60, 70,000 votes in Pennsylvania, I mean, that really matters to not have the sort of robust ground game that they had in previous cycles. So is that concerning to you?
Well, I can tell you what we did in 2016. Those groups, those parties got what we had. And we didn't have many resources, nothing compared to what they have now or even in 2020. But that's more important in many ways than running television ads. Why? Because roughly 1 in 2 households in this country right now, Tim, have a traditional television subscription service. People are streaming, they're giving up their cable TV, or they have Apple TV, or they have something else. They have some other way of seeing it. Even if they watch cable stations like Fox News or CNN, they're doing it on their phones. Why do I say this? I say this because it's even lower in the 7 swing states, the traditional television package. So I know that consultants get a 15 and 20% commission on television ads, but the question is how many eyeballs are seeing that?
Wrong line of work.
I think that, right, aren't we in the wrong line of work? This is true. But I say this just because you got to meet people where they are. Politics 101 is we don't tell people what's important to them, they tell us, and we meet them where they are. And I think in 2020, the Democrats did a much better job of that. But 2024, the Republicans are spending an awful lot of time catching up. Now, you talk about election integrity. President Trump has told, he said it publicly, and he has said it privately, I'll turn out the vote, you go and protect it. And that is what he's talking about. He wants to make sure that people feel comfortable to vote. The best thing he can do at this point is to continue to tell people, vote when you want to vote. If you want to vote early in your state, do that. We already have early voting going on in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was our reach state in 2016. I would go on shows like Morning Joe and say, Pennsylvania is our reach state. They'd say, oh, isn't it the girl that got away, Republican fool's gold? I said it has been, but we see that the messages that are working in states that President Obama carried twice, like Ohio and Iowa, are working in Western Pennsylvania, other areas. We're going to lose the collar counties around Philadelphia, but not as badly as Romney did. So you want to mitigate the natural deficits, not eliminate them, you mitigate them, and then you run up the totals. That Pennsylvania doesn't exist anymore, because they just started voting early. Yes. There was really very little early vote, certainly absentee vote, but there's very little early voting in Pennsylvania. So I think that they've even changed the entire way that they approach those states, and I give them credit for doing that.
Politics 101 is also, you say this a lot, that politics is addition, not subtraction. Sure. I'm just curious here. Does J.D. Vance add a single voter to the Trump coalition who was not already going to vote for Donald Trump? Do you think there was one voter in America who, when he was added to the ticket, said, I wasn't sure before, but now I'm voting Trump?
Yes.
You do?
I do.
Okay.
I do think so. And I think we're going to see a very spirited debate between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance is a Yale Law School educated debater. If you go back and you pull his debate against Tim Ryan, Congressman Tim Ryan, when they ran against each other for United States Senate in Ohio less than 2 years ago, J.D. Vance was excellent. And Tim Ryan, I think, was the best Democratic Senate candidate in 2022. That's my opinion. He was formidable. You know, it's a great story. I think at that point, he ran against Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House, people forget, in 2017, right after Trump won, thinking that the party should learn its lesson and try to go back to being the party of the worker. That didn't work. It didn't work for him. It didn't work for the party. But he's a great debater. And J.D. Vance, if you go back and look, it was an excellent debate. So I think Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, that's going to move. Here's the other thing I'll say about J.D. Vance, and I've said it to him. I didn't know him well at all. And I think if he goes in and keeps talking about things like school choice, where there really is a bright line distinction between the two parties, I am very committed to an issue like that, because I feel, unlike my children who are privileged and go to private schools of our choosing that we can pay for, just like the Obama girls and the Clinton daughter, just like they did. I think if you can do that, that's wonderful. But I really worry, Tim, that we have more and more kids with lost learning in schools that don't serve them well, and that their parents should have other choices. And I say this because I think J.D. Vance can say from Middletown, Ohio, all the way to Yale Law School, I want other kids to have that opportunity. I feel like he should go into issues like that, talk about the forgotten man, forgotten woman. Here's the thing about J.D. Vance.
So more school choice, less childless cat ladies.
No, well,
Again,
I don't say it, but again, that's all baked in now, and we have a tied race with Trump slightly ahead in these swing states. Well, so again, everybody can keep talking about that.
No. Well,
and we keep showing Kamala Harris, though, banning fracking, reimagining public safety, and then pretending she's not for those things. We have no combat troops. In other words,
she's ripe for those attacks. Sure.
Well, but those are substantive things that a sitting vice president is saying she's changed her mind on. And I think if people instead of saying we're better off 4 years ago, that's not the construct, because 4 years ago this country was hurting. 5 years ago, do you want Trump 2019, when we had the highest wage per household in modern American history, low interest rates, low unemployment, high consumer confidence, high confidence among small business owners, a more secure border, no foreign wars, Soleimani, al-Baghdadi, gone. In other words, all these things. A president that kept the promise of 7 presidents, Republican and Democrat, to move that embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize it as the capital of Israel, and on and on and on. I say this because you compare that to Harris 2019, when she was out running her own campaign from scratch. Then it's destroying private health care, it's Green New Deal stuff, it's banning fracking, it's reimagining public safety.
And J.D. Vance, not far before that, was calling him America's Hitler.
We know
so
all
people
that.
are changing over a period of time.
And we know all that.
But I want to focus on Vance for a second,
about J.D. Vance. I want to say this
Yeah,
about J.D. Vance. I think turning the spigot on him full blast in the first day or two was a mistake.
Oh, you think?
I do. And here's why. Because what else is there? In other words, if you want to hurt someone, you dribble it out. But everybody, the media were so excited to maybe drown him and think Trump would leave him without a lifeboat, and Trump's not going to do that. He's not going to do that any more than he's going to fire his campaign team, said the recommendation coming from people who don't like him and will never vote for him, and spent years convincing us that behind the scenes, outside of public view, President Biden is somehow a trapeze artist triathlete. So I'm glad he ignored the advice from people.
Trump's not going to fire his campaign team, but I am curious, just like as a fun little social experiment here, just us girls, if Trump could go back in time, just a couple of months, because he makes the J.D. Vance pick when he is riding high and his team is openly talking to me and in the Atlantic about a blowout, 325 electoral votes. And it felt like at that point that the Vance pick was a luxury that they were making, that he was sort of choosing an heir apparent rather than a sort of governing partner and someone who could be additive to the ticket. If Trump knew that Biden was going to get out 4 days later, do you think he would have picked someone else?
No. He wanted Senator Vance really all along, kept going back to those last 3 finalists, and said that publicly, so I'm not saying anything that everybody didn't hear. So no, I think he always wanted somebody who he thinks is willing to go into enemy territory, the lion's den on TV, because he had seen J.D. Vance on CNN, on MSNBC, on the 3 major networks, unafraid to talk about America First. He likes his life story. He likes those great academic credentials like Yale Law School, but he also loves that tale of the American dream. And, I worked on the opioid crisis in the White House with the president and the first lady. They broke the back of, we had the first decline in overdose deaths in 29 years. And that's very near and dear to him. And he sees the story, he sees sort of the arc and knows other people can look at that. And I'll say this, I actually think the entire construct that you're asking me is really a question for Vice President Harris, as goes Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. I actually think that was a no-brainer. You stabilize the Jewish vote. You show them that you're not just trying to mollify at all turns the 31 Democratic members of the House of Representatives who voted against a resolution on October 18th, 11 short days after the October 7th murders of 1,200 innocent Israelis.
And it's the single state that will decide the election.
But they voted against a resolution to condemn Hamas as a terrorist group. Basically, what our State Department has done under Republican and Democratic presidents. It wasn't it was a layup.
Yes.
And you have 31 Democrats, 2 who have since lost their primaries. With that as a big issue. 31 Democrats voting against that resolution. So she's got to deal a lot with, it's not just on college campuses, folks, it's in the halls of Congress, and it's scary stuff on any given day. But she has to deal with that, I think, and then picking somebody who I think is better on school choice and charter schools than the average Democrat, Josh Shapiro, is better on fracking than the average Pennsylvania Democrat has been. I think that was a huge miss.
But he can't wear a camouflage hat like Tim Walz can. We're running up against it. I want to ask you one other thing. Speaking of VPs, so long before you were involved with Donald Trump running for president, Mike Pence was a longtime client of yours. And in fact, I've reported in my first book, also available on paperback, that...
Buy one, get one free.
Yes, that's right. That you played probably the pivotal role in not only connecting Pence to Trump, but then persuading Trump that this was the right pick. And here we are, 8 years later, and Donald Trump's former vice president is refusing to endorse him. What do you make of that?
It's a free country. I mean, Kamala Harris is saying she's not Joe Biden, the man that she's serving as his second in command. I think it's a little rude.
It's a little apples to
It's
oranges.
a little not nice. So I think the Pence pick was the best pick. And the two runners up to that, Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich, are friends of mine. And Newt is a mentor of mine. But I didn't think that was the right winning formula for 2016. And they stayed very close friends and advisors to President Trump all along. The Pence pick worked for lots of reasons that I still think is relevant, and I think it had a lot to do, and I kept watching the JD and Trump advisors talk about this before, during, and after the Vance pick, which is that you can bust into the upper Midwest and Rust Belt states. This was incredibly important in 2016 because I believed and said many times publicly that Hillary's blue wall was very real. That was a real thing. She started out with 264 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. That's scary stuff. And so the idea was you got to pick a partner on the ticket who has credibility and reach there. So basically it could have been Governor Kasich of Ohio, Governor Pence of Indiana, Governor Walker of Wisconsin. But the thing about Mike Pence is he also, I think, mollified and gave a lot of comfort to and credibility to the evangelical Christians,
Yes,
but also
yes.
the constitutional conservatives, knowing that President Trump would be filling a lot of federal court vacancies, including definitely the Antonin Scalia
And so the
seat,
campaign
and then two more.
strategery aside, though, is it...
And he had been in the House. He had been. I wanted to say that. Donald Trump said when he became the nominee, he said, the one thing I don't really have experience in is Washington. I've never even spent a night there that I can remember. I want somebody with Washington experience. So Pence had 12 years of Washington experience, but never became Washington, never became like this Washington insider. And he was sitting governor of Indiana. By the way, that is a relationship. I was there every day of that White House. That was a presidency and a vice presidency that worked for 3 years, 11 months, and 2 weeks. And it worked very well, and they got a lot done. And I think that was a great pairing until it didn't work. And I'm sorry the way that's all gone down.
Until it didn't work, yes.
Until it didn't work.
So just to be clear on this, I mean, part of your explanation there for picking him in the first place was that he is a constitutional conservative. Is your read on this that in the president asking him to violate his oath to the Constitution on January 6th, that he no longer views Trump as fit for office? Because he has sort of danced around that precise explanation, but if you read his book and if you talk to people close to him, that's what he seems to believe.
You have to ask him that. I think he's been on the record with this many, many times, and as have I. Again, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, Tim Alberta, who's probably much more popular and would have been better on the ticket, is, if you go back to what I call the greatest leftist hits, you're not engaging. I promise you, you're enraging people have already decided.
These aren't the leftist
They probably
hits.
already
Mike
voted.
Pence is not the
Hold on.
leftist hits.
No. You're getting in there January 6th and this, that, and the other. Because I'm telling you, the last mile here, the 5% who are going to decide this election and say they are mostly economic voters, mostly, when they hear this, they feel like you're trying to enrage them and not engage them. They feel disrespected. And so I think that's why this race is close. And I think that's why on some days President Trump says, I've never had more people. 60,000 people RSVPing in Uniondale in Long Island what was last night, Wednesday night, in a state that's, quote, blue. You can't see that ever. I went to Nassau Coliseum to see, took my son, and my neighbor took her son a couple years ago to see the great Elton John perform. There weren't people outside saying, gee, I couldn't get in. Donald Trump likes to say he packs more people into an arena than anybody who's never had a microphone or a piano or a guitar. And he does. And folks, you may say it doesn't matter. They're all the base. It does matter. People are showing up, but people are still afraid to say they're voting Trump. And that's the other thing I want to say. I coined that term in 2016, the undercover hidden Trump voter, to international ridicule. Kellyanne, they'll still be hidden on election day, ha, ha, ha. They were real. They're more real now because they're more afraid now. They don't want every night to feel like Thanksgiving with the in-laws. They don't want to argue with people in their family and friends and coworkers. And some of them don't want to get a C when they've earned an A from that professor. Some of them don't want to feel like they won't be promoted or hired because of their politics. Do you think there are hidden Kamala Harris voters in this country? Do you think so? Or do you think they're all out and about, very excited, peacocking? So that's the other big X factor here, it is difficult to get Trump voters to fully admit that they're supporting him.
We are getting yelled at. So we're going to get out of here, and I want to thank you for your time. A quick yes or no question. Before, hold your applause. A quick yes or no
This will
question.
be another softball.
Can you conceive of a scenario in which Trump loses and graciously concedes defeat?
Yes.
You can.
Yes, of course he can. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I really hope there's a third debate. I bet everybody here hopes there's a third debate. I do hope there's another debate because we the people need to see, they had never even met before. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump had never been in the same room before, apparently. I didn't even know that until I read that, let alone the same stage.
We could
do it
just
right
bring
here.
it right up here.
But I'm all for it, and we'll see how that changes over time. Look, the stakes are really high. People in this country are suffering. A lot of people that Donald Trump said were forgotten men, forgotten women, forgotten children now feel invisible. And I think that, look, these issue sets, I'll leave you on this. We are a divided country politically, but we're also divided, we're also cleaved culturally. And I think this time, one area, one component I'm examining that really didn't exist before, we didn't talk about it before, is what I call the double gender gap. So the first job in polling I took, Frank Luntz helped me get an $8 an hour job when I was 21. I'm 57. It's a long time ago. At the Wirthlin Group, that was Ronald Reagan's pollster at the end of the Reagan years. And Dr. Wirthlin was one of the originators of the gender gap, trying to explain why, even though at the time, President Reagan beat Jimmy Carter, he lost among women. And then won among certain women in '84 when it was a blowout and you had Geraldine Ferraro on the ticket, but lost among other women. And we've been studying it ever since. There are two gender gaps right now. Harris is doing much better among women. Trump's doing much better among men. And that gender gap between male and female voters is exploding among our youngest voters. And that is something, again, it's a free country, vote and think how you wish. I hope people do. But that is something I'm really keeping an eye on because it caught my attention just this morning in the new Fox News poll. Trump voters were asked, what are the most important issues to you in deciding your vote? And they said economy and immigration, number one and number two, in the 40s both. Harris voters were asked, what's the most important issue to you? Abortion, number one, and stopping the other side, number two. Usually, your voters are pretty much saying the same thing, but they like your policy more. We have entirely different kaleidoscopes through which we're even looking at these candidates and this election and what's at stake. So we have to be, I think, respectful of that. I don't think it's a great idea to call people irredeemable, deplorable, mega mag extremist. I agree with Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. He says, I'm not a Trump guy, but he says don't insult the other people. I heard Tim Walz say that at some point. I hope he'll say it again. Because that is the one thing, I mean, we just, ma'am, at least I show up. But anyway, and I put up and I stand up and I speak up, and that's my right. But the fact is that we have to find a way to be more respectful to each other. You may say, well, Trump said this, and I got it. Folks, I'm talking to you. I'm talking to me. As a mother of 4 teenagers, I think it's important to recognize that most people are not talking about this stuff. They're talking about what's vexing and perplexing them. And the more that people can hear them and respond to their very true, clear, and present needs, I think the better we'll do. But this double gender gap is really fascinating to me because, look, President Trump beat a woman before. He could beat a woman again, as the majority of voters are female, just like they've been for every presidential election, Tim, since 1964. We decide who the presidents are. And it's a very different opponent this time. I think there are assets and liabilities that did not exist with Secretary Clinton. But the point I'm making is, I think abortion is a vote motivator and a turnout intensifier for the Democrats. And I think that on the Trump side of the ledger, people are coming out and saying, maybe I don't care for what he said, what he tweeted, this, that, and the other, but I want that economy back. That's no small thing to a growing slice in this country. And if all these polls are right, that he's getting anywhere from 20 to 24% of African-American black voters, he's getting over 40% of Hispanics, he doesn't need a majority of the following groups.
If that happens, he's going to win. But
yes.
that is an enormous if.
Yes, it's an enormous if, but you know what? Both sides are running out of time.
And we have already
We're
run
running
out of time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, guys.
Great to see you.
Thank you, Kurt.
For a discussion about America's energy future, please welcome U.S. Department of Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. And here to lead the conversation is Atlantic Senior Editor Vann R. Newkirk II.
How y'all feeling? Y'all awake? Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. And I guess we'll jump right in. We want to talk about America's clean energy future. And I imagine you might have a few things to say about that.
You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Everybody who cares about climate change and this clean energy future should feel really, really great about where we started and where we're going. The president has this goal of getting 100% of clean electricity on the grid by 2035. And you should know that because of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, by 2030, we will have, in America, 80% of our grid powered by clean, zero carbon emitting energy. Fantastic, right? So I feel really great about that and about the greenhouse gas reductions that go along with it.
Let's take a step back. What exactly is the Department of Energy's role in this energy transition?
Yeah, we are in it, top to bottom, side to side, and everywhere in between. So the Department of Energy, for those of you who may not follow this so closely and who would, we have been historically a research, science, and development agency. We have 17 national laboratories. We're doing all of this research in next generation energy products, how to make them better, technologies. And we also shepherd the nation's nuclear stockpile. When this administration came in and passed those amazing laws, we reorganized the Department of Energy entirely to have a column that focuses on deployment. So while we have done research and development and early stage demonstration of clean energy, now we do full-on deployment. Our motto inside the department is deploy, deploy, deploy. We've hired 1,000 people to make sure we can get these clean technologies out across the country. And that's the results that we are seeing is because of the efforts inside of the Department of Energy and the great folks who work there, top to bottom.
So what are your big ticket items in the department over the last couple years and in the future?
Well, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Department of Energy was given about $100 billion to get these technologies in partnership with the private sector out. And so, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law is largely a law that allows us to offer grants to key technologies to be able to see them deployed. And the Inflation Reduction Act offers incentives for companies like tax credits, et cetera, to lure them to the United States. So we have, since the passage of those laws, seen $500 billion invested across America, $6 by the private sector, $1 by the public sector, in pockets all across America. We have over 800 factories that have announced that they are coming or expanding in America to produce the clean energy technologies that will get us to this big goal of 100% clean. That's happening all across the country. And so the big players in that, of course, end up being solar and wind from just a deployment point of view. We're also obviously investing in all other kinds of energy. I know we can talk about these next generation technologies, but you should also be excited that, if you look under the hood of those stats that I was giving by 2030, we're going to see this year, in terms of the amount of energy we add to this grid, we will be adding 60 gigawatts of energy to our transmission grid this year. 60 gigawatts is essentially 30 Hoover dams. And in that 30 Hoover dams that we're adding, and of course we have to add more clean energy to the grid because we want to electrify transportation. We want to make sure that we have enough power for all these data centers with AI that are coming on board. And then all these factories that are opening up across the country require all this new energy. But on the solar side, we will be adding this year 38 gigawatts, so 19 Hoover dams of just solar on our grid this year.
Now, you mentioned powering our data centers. Is there competition in that grid now? Will we have enough grid capacity for America's AI goals in the future and also be able to meet our clean energy goals?
Yeah, that's exactly what we are focusing on. This is why we're adding so much power to the grid now, and we are also investing in next generation technologies in addition to solar, because these data centers, and everybody wants to see clean baseload power, right? And that's power that is not just solar when the sun shines and not just wind when the wind blows, but also what are the technologies that make those technologies like baseload so that they're available 24/7. And the biggest technology to do that, of course, is battery storage. And so we've invested in long duration battery storage for utilities. If you can get batteries that last 10 hours or more, that wind and solar become like baseload. But we're also investing in other types of clean energy that's 24/7. For example, one of my favorites is enhanced geothermal, bless you, enhanced geothermal, and that is the heat beneath our feet. And that is very exciting because we think we've got, 150 Hoover dams worth of base load power from enhanced geothermal to be able to add to the grid. So these next generation technologies are exciting, but we're also seeing these data centers partner with next generation geothermal companies or small modular reactors, nuclear companies that are building these smaller reactors, not just the big AP1000s that are 1 gigawatt, but maybe they're 300 megawatt plants that are more modular and can be used in all sorts of ways. So bottom line is we can totally add the amount of power that's necessary that is clean to the grid, and these laws that were passed and signed into law by the president and voted, the deciding vote by the vice president, these laws are enabling us to be able to do that as a nation.
Now, obviously, in the 4 years prior to 2021, the department had a slightly different clean energy strategy, or lack thereof. And has it been difficult? Has it been a challenge for you and the department to ramp up quickly after that radical shift in priorities?
I think the department itself, full of an unbelievable civil servants, are all about science, and they are excited to be able to work on the technologies that get us to these goals of solving climate change and of adding this clean electricity to the grid. So honestly, when these laws came into being and we reorganized the department to be able to account for that, people have been totally excited and totally enthused about, about working in this department. We are now one of the best places to work in the federal government, and people love the mission. Of course, if you've got a mission that you believe you are solving the biggest existential problem we have, who wouldn't want to be there? If you are investing at an unbelievable rate in solving that problem, we're in the middle. I mean, as we say, I have an all-hands meeting shortly after this, and so, I'll remind people that, sometimes when you're in the middle of history, it's hard to know because you're in the middle of it. But this is history making, what is happening now across the country in this deployment of clean energy. Our folks really feel that mission.
It's September, mid-September, and the election's around the corner. On the other side of this, how is the department thinking about, with all of these new priorities, all of people who are involved in this radical transformation, safeguarding that kind of work and that strategy?
Well, obviously, we have over 100,000 people. Most of them are civil servants, and so they take that responsibility of shepherding the department and its mission very seriously. We have, because we were given a huge amount of resources to be able to do all of this deployment, our focus has been on how do we make sure that we make the selections that are necessary so that that money is secured and it will go forth. And so we have been doing really well in terms of being able to make those selections. So by the time that there is a transition, we believe that things will have been well in motion in a way that can't be undone.
Under
We're
y'all
aware.
are awake. Y'all are under the Biden administration's Justice 40 program. 40% of the overall benefits of federal climate and clean energy programs, they should flow to disadvantaged communities. How is the department identifying and what those benefits are and how they are quantified?
Yeah, this is such an important question because, well, first of all, the laws themselves embed equity into them, meaning that for example, say you are a solar developer and you decide that you want to put a community solar project and you put it in a disadvantaged community, perhaps adjacent to public housing. So you get a 30% tax credit, essentially, as a solar developer for doing a solar project. That's a tax credit, not a tax deduction, right? So on top of that, if you put in that development using American-made solar panels, you get another 10%. So now it's a 40% tax credit. If you locate in a disadvantaged community, you get another 10%. Now it's a 50% tax credit. If you locate next to multifamily housing, affordable housing, you get another percentage tax credit. So you can get up to, and if you pay prevailing wage and you use apprenticeships, you can get another 10%. You can get up to 60 to 70% tax credit for locating that clean energy project in a community that has been left behind. And that's embedded equity into these laws, which is great, number one. Number two, when we give out grants to companies, these are all competitive grants, right? So we evaluate them based upon a community benefits plan. And that community benefits plan has to say, what are you doing for the community? Are you engaging with the community? How many jobs will go to the community? How will you benefit the workforce in that community? And I say that because of all of the funding that I was talking about, like that $500 billion, 81% of that are going to counties with below average wages. So that's rural areas, that is urban areas, but these are communities that are hungry. 81% of all of those opportunities are going to communities where people are looking and are hungry for those opportunities. So it's working that we are, I think, in the Jewish tradition, they have tikkun olam, which is you heal the world. The way this has been deployed, the way this is working, is that we are healing the world by giving opportunities for these communities. So we're excited about that.
Let's talk LNG. So recently, the department's been in the news because a federal judge blocked the administration's pause on LNG, liquefied natural gas exports. What sort of levers are there left to continue the policy?
Well, what we, of course, just to put this in perspective, liquefied natural gas is the gas that's exported from the United States because you have to liquefy it in order to transit it to countries who want it, right? We are the largest exporter of natural gas in this fashion in the world. And there's so much that is queued up to come online that we had to pause just to pause the permitting of new ones. I mean, the existing ones are all going, we're still the largest, all that. But we wanted to take a look using our national labs at, number one, what is going to be the global demand for liquefied natural gas going forward? What are the greenhouse gas impacts of this infrastructure? Will we be building stranded infrastructure? Will there be demand, right? And what are the greenhouse gas impacts What is the demand looking like from our allies, like who are looking for natural gas? And what are the impacts on the ground where these terminals are, often on the Gulf Coast, often in disadvantaged communities that have felt the negative impacts of these developments? So our labs are in the process of doing a study, and we said we're going to pause new permits until we get the results of this so that we can evaluate those requests based upon the most recent data. The judge came in and said, you can't pause. You've got to continue to permit. And so, since we got that ruling, we have permitted one additional facility, but we're evaluating them all as they come in, and this study that we are doing should be, the first draft of it should be out by the end of this year for public comment so that we can continue to evaluate the impacts, both positive and negative, of LNG across the globe.
Depending on the results of that report, would the department and the administration be looking to or be open to changing our LNG policy?
Well, let's just say that the Natural Gas Act requires us to evaluate permits or authorizations based upon whether it's in the public interest. And so what's in the public interest has to be evaluated based upon science and our best data. And so, you know, we're going to look at what those factors are when it comes in from the studies. So there may or may not be an adjustment depending on what the studies find.
How is the department managing the workforce effects of this transition?
Of the clean energy transition? Okay. This is amazing to me. First of all, we know that the job creation rate under this administration has been amazing, right? More jobs created than any administration in any time in American history. That's great. The clean energy component of that is also great. Just in the clean energy space, over 400,000 jobs have already been created. That is twice the rate of growth than in the rest of the economy. And those are happening in all pockets of the country, giving opportunity all the way across the nation. It's very exciting.
What is the role of nuclear in this portfolio going forward?
Yeah, we're very bullish on nuclear. The next generation reactors, these small modular reactors that I was referring to when we were talking about the data centers, they are very promising. Our allies around the world would like to see them as well. We have a gold standard regulatory regime in the United States because the first issue is, are they safe, right? And we have the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act have incentivized additional nuclear. Now, they're expensive. Nuclear is expensive. And so the question is, at what point will there actually be a tipping point for, because once you can take these small modular reactors to scale, you can see more of them because the costs will be reduced. We're hoping that these hyperscalers, the data center folks, the Microsofts and Googles of the world, that they decide to maybe buy a 6-pack or an 8-pack of these small modular reactors so that they can be manufactured at scale and those prices come down. But the incentives for clean energy are still there with nuclear, existing nuclear as well as new nuclear. And let me just say one other thing about nuclear that I think is very exciting. And in the Department of, so nuclear is about fission, right? Splitting atoms. But the next generation, the really next generation of nuclear is about fusion, which means you push them together and you create energy. And that fusion doesn't create any radioactive waste. And that, if we crack the code on that, so one of our national labs achieved fusion ignition, which means that you got more energy out than put in trying to create the reaction, achieved that in December a year ago. And so that was the first time in the world that that had happened. It tells you the importance of investing in basic science and research. So we know it can happen. Now there's a goal of getting a commercial fusion plant within a decade, and there's all sorts of companies that are investing in making that happen. That kind of clean baseload power is extremely promising, still a little bit out, but we are very bullish on that as well.
While we are still using fission, how do we deal with that waste and make sure that it is equitably sited.
Yeah, this is really important too, because obviously you want to make sure that waste is disposed of in a way that is not where the community accepts it. So we are in the process of something called community-based siting, a process where we are in conversation with a number of communities who are willing, who have the right geography, because often this is disposed of deep beneath the surface, who have the right geography and who are willing and eager to be helpful to our nation, to serve our nation in that way, and would be compensated, obviously, for doing that. So we would like to see this happen in a way that is accepted and embraced by a community, to do the siting of waste facilities. So that's number one. But number two is there's a lot of work that's being done in recycling as well. France, for example, recycles their spent nuclear fuel. And if we can look at that as well, that's another option that many companies, innovators, are now looking at as well in the United States.
Before we let you go, I want to ask you the question that we talked about backstage. Do you and the Department of Education have to fight over who gets to be called the DOE?
We are the DOE. Tell that to Secretary Cardona. No, we are the DOE. And as many of you know, who know acronyms, we are capital D, capital O, capital E. They are capital D, small o, big E. So that's the big difference.
Thank you so much, Secretary.
Still to come on the Ideas stage, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. And now for a conversation about the state of the U.S. economy, please welcome U.S. Department of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. And leading the conversation is Atlantic senior editor Ron Brownstein.
Madam Secretary, so good to be with you again.
Pleasure.
You are also, in addition to your current role, a former chair of the Fed. The Fed yesterday made its long-awaited decision to cut interest rates. What did you make of what they did? Did they go far enough?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the details of their decision, but let me just say I see this as a very positive sign for where the U.S. economy is. It reflects confidence on the part of the Fed that inflation has come way down and is on a path back to the 2% target, and that the risks with respect to inflation have really meaningfully diminished. And at the same time, we have a job market that remains strong, and an overriding concern or motive is to try to make sure it stays strong. And monetary policy has been tight, and readjusting the stance of monetary policy to preserve the strength of the labor market when inflation has come down is what I think this decision signifies.
And does that imply that this should be the first of several cuts?
Well, I think the stance of monetary policy remains restrictive. Chair Powell said yesterday that, and we saw in the projections by the FOMC participants, that the expectation is that interest rates will come down further. But it's, of course, necessary to watch incoming data, and there can always be surprises.
So last time we were on the stage in 2022, there was a great deal of apprehension about the economy, about the Biden administration's management of the economy. Well, here we are now, 2 years later, unemployment 4.2, inflation under 3%, Fed finally cutting interest rates. I know Taylor Swift has been in the news a lot lately. So let me ask you, are we out of the woods?
Well, there are always risks to the economy, so one has to avoid being overconfident here. But when we spoke 2 years ago, what I said was I believed that there was a path to bring inflation down in the context of a strong job market. And if the Fed and the administration's policies could succeed in accomplishing that, we'd call that a soft landing. And I believe that's exactly what we're seeing in the economy.
So just to button up this point, you think we have achieved the soft landing and we will not see unemployment rise unacceptably out of a fear that the Fed waited too long?
So I do believe the job market remains strong. The unemployment rate has moved up meaningfully, but from historically low levels. And it's rare to have, in the United States, unemployment rate with 4 as the first digit. This is a good, strong labor market. It looks a lot like the labor market back in 2019 before the pandemic. It's not as hot as the labor market was a year and a half or 2 years ago when firms were utterly struggling to hire back employees that they had laid off during the pandemic, and there had been huge shifts in demand. Wages were rising very rapidly. Now wages are going up at a good pace, faster than inflation, so workers are getting ahead in real terms. But what we're seeing is a normal, healthy labor market. We still have positive job growth in the economy, and I believe it's possible to stay on this course, and this would be an excellent outcome.
Let me ask you about 2 immediate events in the news. One, how big a disruption to the economy would it be? Biden has pretty clearly signaled his opposition to Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel, citing national security concerns. You chair the committee that reviews these kinds of international economic deals. I know the participants have apparently refiled, which starts the process again. You can't talk about the specifics. At the high level, though, this administration has talked about friendshoring from the beginning, trying to integrate our supply chains more tightly with allied countries. Why would Japan, of all places, be a national security risk to own a major American company?
So again, I'm not able to talk about the specifics of this or any transaction under very strict confidentiality rules that govern CFIUS. But let me say, I do believe that trade and foreign direct investment are very beneficial for the U.S. economy. You're right that we have focused on trying to deepen our ties with trade and investment with a range of countries who are our friends, to diversify our supply chains, and in particular to reduce our dependence on China for a number of key inputs in goods. And foreign direct investment supports millions and millions of jobs in the United States, and foreign firms invest, I believe, $150 billion just last year in the U.S. economy. I think it's critically important to have an open and welcoming environment encouraging foreign direct investment in the United States. But there can be, and CFIUS's job is to identify if there are any national security concerns. And that is always the focus, both in the law and in the process that CFIUS engages in, to see if there are if there are national security concerns, and if so, is it possible to mitigate them? And that's what we do in every case.
And for the acronym challenged in the room, CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which the Treasury Secretary chairs.
Correct.
All right, let me ask you about another area. I know that you can't talk about specific policies or individual candidates in the presidential race, but as much in your kind of life as an economist and as in your current job as Treasury Secretary, I want to ask you about the debate about tariffs. And this kind of fundamental question about tariffs: who pays the tariff? Is it a foreign country that is really paying the tariff, or is it American? If tariffs are raised, is it American consumers who ultimately pay the bill?
Well, there's been a great deal of economic research on this topic, and almost all of it suggests that the purchasers of the goods, in this case Americans, if we have tariffs, will end up paying the tariffs and seeing higher prices for the goods that they purchase.
So the idea that American consumers will be held harmless and this is somehow being paid by China or Europe is...
That's generally not what happens, and there have been many studies that pretty rigorously document that.
Yeah. There was a study, speaking of which, the other day that calculated that undocumented migrants account for 22% of agricultural workers, 15% of construction workers, 8% of manufacturing workers, and 8% of service workers, including childcare workers. In your view, what would be the impact of removing all or most of them from the economy in a short time through a program of mass deportation?
Well, I believe that immigrants have always made and continue to make a positive contribution to the U.S. economy. Between, I think, 2010... You know, we have an aging population. Withdrawing, it's pushing down labor force participation. Between 2010 and 2018, immigrants made up, I believe, 60% of all additions to the labor force. They obviously contribute to the dynamism of the U.S. economy, and we need, I believe, an orderly immigration system. And there's obviously work to do for Congress to work with the administration to accomplish that, but I think it would be devastating to simply
remove that
remove
now,
this number of immigrants.
Would that, there's been a lot of debate about whether that would relieve pressure on prices or removing that many workers, particularly from agricultural and construction. What would that mean, in your view, for inflation?
Well, I think it would raise inflation. These workers have contributed to America's ability to produce more goods, including agricultural goods. And this influx we've seen since the pandemic, and it's not only through immigration, it's also, we're seeing the highest labor force participation on record for adult women. The influx of workers into the labor market is something that's helped to bring down inflation and create a lot of jobs.
The biggest fiscal policy decision facing the next president, the end of next year, the Trump tax cuts passed in 2017 expire. Let's kind of walk through the different scenarios. In your view, what would be the impact of extending the entire tax cut as it was passed in 2017?
So if the entire tax cut is just extended and nothing is allowed to expire, I believe the Congressional Budget Office is estimated that over 10 years, that would be almost a $5 trillion blow to the overall budget deficit. And honestly, I really believe that's something the United States can't afford. We need to be on a sustainable fiscal path. If we extend any of the tax cuts, and President Biden and Vice President Harris have suggested extending the tax cuts that benefited middle-class families, families making under $400,000, increasing the child tax credit, ways absolutely have to be found to pay for that. And in addition, we need to lower deficits to stay on a fiscally sustainable path.
Given the pressure on deficits that CBO shows, and given what you said before about an aging society, what's the case against just letting the whole thing expire? Why extend it for people up to 400 or 450,000? Is there a case for just letting the whole thing go away in 2025 and returning to the tax code under Obama?
Well, you know, President Biden and Vice President Harris are really concerned about the ability of middle-class families to make ends meet. And they really face a variety of stresses due to the high cost of living, particularly in areas like childcare, healthcare, housing. And they believe it's the right thing to allow middle-income families not to see their taxes increase. Now, the cost of that is only a fraction of what it would be to extend all of those tax cuts, because they mainly benefited very high-income people, wealthy people, and corporations, and they've expressed opposition to allowing that to happen. On top of that, there are ways to pay for both investments that make our economy function better, more productive, and address the high cost of living that is of such concern to Americans.
And you believe that if you look at the costs of the investment agenda, what the administration wants to do, the care economy, as well as the cost of an aging society, that all of that can be funded primarily by raising taxes on people at the very top, as opposed to clawing back some of the cuts that Republicans have made under Bush and under Trump among people who are kind of upper middle when we're talking about 400,000. I mean, is it really plausible to do all the things that Democrats want to do in the long run solely by raising taxes on the very top 5% or so?
Well, I believe it actually is. Okay. And we've presented a budget for 2025 that does bring back the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, invests in our economy in ways that will boost long-run productivity, and in addition to that, achieves $3 trillion of deficit reduction. In part, the wealthiest individuals, much of their income comes from capital gains, which, until they're realized, are never taxed and often escape taxation entirely through step-up of basis when people die. And the impact of that is that some of the wealthiest Americans, the highest income Americans, are paying average taxes that are under 10%. And something like 60% of those people pay 2% or less, yeah, which is less than a school teacher or policeman pay on their income. And we need a fairer tax system.
Let's turn to another issue. Let's turn to another issue that has occupied a lot of your time, China. This summer, President Biden issued an executive order limiting U.S. investments in Chinese technology companies. Last week, finalized a series of tariffs on Chinese imports, EVs, EV batteries, solar panels, critical mineral, steel, and aluminum. Are you concerned about the direction of the economic relationship between these two giant economies, particularly when the U.S. is so dependent, so intertwined with China in its modern economy?
So we have an extensive trade and investment relationship with China, and I believe most of it is beneficial both to the United States and also to China, and uncontroversial. It doesn't raise national security issues and doesn't raise profound issues of unfair trade. And I think it's important, and I've worked to develop a relationship with China in which that kind of trade and investment can continue to thrive, and we, on both sides, recognize the benefits of it. That said, we do have concerns, and we have national security concerns. The United States is not going to compromise when it comes to threats to our national security impact. We do have export controls. We have controlled the exports of goods that we think can boost China's military in ways that will be damaging to U.S. national security. And in addition to that, we have extreme supply chain dependence, and I would say over-dependence in many areas in China. In some cases, these are areas where China is heavily engaged in building capacity through enormous subsidies to their industry. And those are areas where we do have concerns. We feel trade should be on a level playing field, and we want to make sure that we have resilient and diverse supply chains. The tariffs that you mentioned that we put on electric vehicles and on battery components, aluminum and steel, these are areas where China has enormous excess capacity. We've made a conscious decision that in the area of clean energy, we want to develop this as an industry in the United States. That's not to say we want to do everything entirely ourselves. We believe in friendshoring. We've built and deepened ties with many countries that in Latin America, in Asia, that can be part of those supply chains, but we really want to reduce our dependence on China. The tariffs that you mentioned that we put on those goods, you're talking about $18 billion worth of imports at the moment. So these are very targeted interventions in areas where we feel we have a legitimate concern.
It isn't just supply chain, though, right? I mean, as you point out, the administration has put enormous effort into accelerating the development of the clean energy industries in the U.S., which Treasury has been involved in tracking all of the construction spending that's going on. Are you concerned that without these tariffs, Chinese imports would simply kind of overwhelm those nascent industries that we are trying to develop in the U.S.? Is this fundamentally about protecting the new clean energy industries domestically?
That is an important motive. And at the moment, in areas like solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, electric batteries, China's prices and costs are extremely low. All of these are areas that China has engaged in enormous investment in over the last decade. And in many cases, there is just utter overcapacity in China. So China's production of solar panels exceeds total global demand. The Chinese government at all levels has been throwing money to develop these industries. And yes, I would say without some protection, our industry is not going to get off the ground. And this is a conscious decision that while we're certainly willing to engage in trade and clean energy with friends, we do want to have some presence in the United States in these industries of the future that are important in supplying jobs too, good jobs, especially to people who don't have a college education.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question about this, which goes back into the past. You served in the Bill Clinton administration as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. You're the only person who has the triple crown of CEA, Fed, and Treasury Secretary. Quite an accomplishment. But in the Clinton era, there was, and certainly that he believed that integrating China into the global economy was a way not only of providing economic opportunity around, for the developed world, but also moderating its behavior. And that there was a value in kind of building economic ties and lowering trade barriers around the world. I would say if there's one area of convergence between Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, J.D. Vance, and Donald Trump, it is kind of and Joe Biden in many ways, it is the rejection of that view. Has the pendulum swung too far in the other direction in your view? Are we missing an opportunity as countries really around the world become more focused on nurturing these domestic industries and building barriers to more economic integration?
So I think what we saw, so first of all, I think some of the hopes and aspirations we had for the development of China, growing democracy, hopefully in China, along with economic development, we've been disappointed that that hasn't come to pass. And I think the impact of China, our burgeoning trade with China in the aftermath of China's joining the WTO, it really imposed, along with other factors, harm on especially workers in America who lacked a college education. And we experienced something that's referred to as the China shock. And we saw several million manufacturing jobs in parts of the country that truly needed these jobs. They disappeared. And trade is good and it can enhance overall the welfare of a country, but if the gains are not sufficiently widespread, it's something that is not sustainable over the longer run. And I think we saw that while there may have been gains, there were a significant group of Americans that were losers. And this is not to say that we should shut down trade and investment with China. We gain from much of it, but I think the attitude about what impact does it have on the United States has become more realistic over time.
And this shift in temperature toward China, do you see it reversing anytime soon, or is this now the new policy consensus in the U.S. that's going to endure?
Well, there does seem to be bipartisan agreement. And my concern, I understand the rationale for it and agree with it, but I do think that we have a deep trade and investment relationship with China, and much of it is beneficial to America. It supports our export industries. We gain new technology from it. It's a benefit to America, and I would not want to see this backlash proceed to the point where we really interfere with those benefits.
Secretary Yellen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Here to discuss the future of global and domestic democracy, please welcome Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. Here to lead the conversation is The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
So it seems like a tough crowd for you. Yeah. We had Kellyanne up here in the morning, so it might go a little bit easier for you, but not by much. We'll try to keep it lively. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming to the Atlantic Festival. It's nice to see all of you here. Leader Jeffries, thank you very much for coming. You're a regular at this, and we appreciate it. Let's just talk, before we talk about some of the huge issues facing us, especially in the next 45, 50 days. Yeah. Let's talk about some things in the news right away. The Lebanon beeper attack leading to, do you think it's leading to an escalation toward total war between Iran and Israel? Where do you come down on this question of whether it was a wise thing to do?
Yeah, first of all, it's great to be here with all of you. Great to be with you, Jeffrey. Great to be with Lorraine, the entire Atlantic team, and each and every one of you. Listen, it's been a challenging situation on the global stage. We've seen this in the context of the Middle East, what's happening in Gaza, as well as, of course, in other hotspots across the world, particularly Ukraine. I think there are two things that are happening right now in the region. One, I fully support President Biden's efforts, along with Vice President Harris, to arrive at a peace agreement in Gaza. We need to make sure that we can free the hostages, that we can surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza for Palestinian civilians, and that we can find a path to a just and lasting peace.
Does a Jeffries peace agreement in Gaza keep Hamas in power?
I think that what needs to one, Hamas, which perpetrated a brutal attack, should no longer be in power. And of course, Israel's objectives in that regard are the right thing to do for the country, given just the brutality and Hamas's sworn declaration to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And they've obviously acted upon it. The peace agreement that President Biden has put forth would involve transitioning to new Palestinian leadership, partnering, of course, with moderate Arab states like Egypt and Jordan, which have had peace with Israel in one instance since 1979, in another instance since the 1990s. This can be done. We also have to, of course, strengthen the economic opportunities for the Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank. Arrive at a situation, I support a two-state solution. We've got to make sure that you've got a safe and secure Israel living side by side with a Palestinian state that provides dignity and self-determination.
Seems farther and farther away than ever.
I think it's been a great challenge for decades, and presidents have come and gone. No one's been able to make the type of progress that I think we all would like to see, but we can't walk away from it. In terms of what's happening, on Israel's northern border, Hezbollah is a very dangerous, Iranian-backed proxy group, and I think tens of thousands of people have been displaced from the northern border in Israel, and that dynamic is going to have to be worked out. I was with Secretary Austin yesterday, and he made clear that, look, we have to do everything possible to avoid full-scale, all-out war. That won't work out well for anyone. And President Biden is continuing to lean into that objective.
So do you think that the attack, the beeper attack, while tactically clever and impressive, was strategically dumb on Israel's part?
I don't know what prompted the attack, but it's basically been, a ongoing skirmish that has been taking place between Hezbollah and the IDF forces shortly after October 7th. It hasn't gotten a lot of the attention, but it's been active and it's been back and forth. And as a result, you've got people, innocent Israelis on the northern border who've been displaced. And it's untenable for that to continue to exist along with the people who've been displaced.
Do you agree with President Biden and Vice President Harris that the withholding of certain arms from Israel is a legitimate way to modify Israeli behavior?
I think that, as President Biden and Vice President Harris have said, we've got to make sure, one, there's a special relationship between our two countries. And Israel, of course, has the right to defend itself, and our commitment to that is ironclad and should be ironclad. At the same time, in the context of Israel's right to defend itself, we have to make sure that they do so in a manner that minimizes and or eliminates civilian casualties, because the count has been significant, and that's been well documented.
Okay, but would you withhold weapons?
Well, I think our view is that when we allocate weapons not simply connected to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. It's got to be connected to the broader dynamics in the region, which is very dangerous. And you have a situation where you have Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iran with nuclear aspirations threatening to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. In that context, you can achieve peace, but you've got to achieve peace through strength. So, the administration is going to do what they have to do. They haven't explained any perspective to us as to what Congress has allocated and what they choose to hold back. And the overwhelming majority of weapons, often defensive, David's arrow, sling, Iron Dome, these are things that save lives and minimize casualties on both sides of conflict.
I'll take that as a kind of soft, no, I don't agree.
Yeah.
Speaking of peace through strength, let's talk about Ukraine. We can move to the politics of Ukraine in a minute, but one of the fascinating things about your district, which is in the best borough of New York City, is that...
That would be Brooklyn, y'all.
Yeah, yeah. That was not a plug for Staten Island. No offense, I don't need that. But you have the largest, we believe, the largest Russian native-speaking population in your district, any district in the country. And I'm wondering how that that those many thousands of constituents have shaped your view of this. Obviously, very famously, you, in the course of saving Mike Johnson's speakership, and we'll get to that, you got through a very substantial aid package to Ukraine. So talk about your feelings about Ukraine, why it's so important to you, what you're learning from your constituents, and what you think Donald Trump would do if he becomes president.
Yeah. Well,
that's your homework. That's a lot of essays. Sorry, but go knock them off.
Well, in terms of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we've got to push back against Russian aggression. Our view, as we were working through making sure that Ukraine had what it needed in order to defend its territorial integrity, but also the values that all of us hold dear, was absolutely essential. And they've fought a valiant battle against a brutal enemy, and it's been ongoing now for 2+ years. The partnership with the United States has been important, and that must continue. The way in which many of us looked at the national security legislative battle was that this was a Churchill or Chamberlain moment. A Churchill or Chamberlain moment. We either confront aggression or we appease it. And appeasement never works, particularly when you have a brutal type of dictator who's at the helm, and that would be Vladimir Putin. The other thing that was clear to us is that this is an existential conflict in the world between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy, the forces of freedom versus the forces of tyranny, the forces of truth versus the forces of propaganda. Ukraine stands on the side of democracy, freedom, and truth, and so should the United States of America, and that's what we've been doing.
Talk about your constituents a little bit. Yeah. I'm curious.
And, in terms of the district, I have the honor of representing one of the most diverse districts in the country. Actually, it historically has been the 9th most African-American district and the 16th most Jewish. I have a good friend, Leon Goldberg. He tells me all the time, Hakeem, you got the best of both worlds. And I absolutely do. It's a great honor in that regard. And within, the Jewish diaspora within the district that I represent, I have the honor of serving the entire spectrum, within the Jewish community. So that's the secular Jewish community, the Reform Jewish community, the conservative Jewish community, the Orthodox Jewish community, the modern Orthodox Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And
you have a lot of meetings.
And so it's incredible. And more Russian-speaking Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union. I represent Brighton Beach and the Coney Island Peninsula. More Russian-speaking Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, than any other member of Congress in the country. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries, who knew?
America's awesome, isn't it?
Awesome. America's awesome. Brooklyn's awesome. And so in that context, right, other than defending those values that we talked about, democracy, freedom, truth, and pushing back against brutal Russian aggression, it was deeply personal for many of the people that I represent, whose families, whose hometowns, whose livelihood, in many ways, they felt directly impacted because of what was happening in Ukraine. And we were determined to get this done, and we found a path forward to make sure that America got it done.
I mentioned Mike Johnson. Let's talk about him for a minute. You're the leader of the more functional caucus in the House right now, and
that would be an understatement.
And famously, I'm trying to keep it neutral, right? Famously, you related to the Ukraine aid bill, you came in and rode to the rescue rather than let them flame out again and possibly lose a speaker after just a few weeks. You're in a kind of a same position now. He has an uncontrollable far-right faction. We're going to see you riding in anytime soon to save Johnson again?
Well, with respect to the question of the Ukraine funding and its connection to the second motion to vacate, we came to the conclusion after a prolonged journey of several months of the funding not making it to Ukraine and that having, real on-the-ground consequences in terms of the battlefield and the progress that the Ukrainian people had made pushed back significantly as a result of the delay. And the far right, as you indicated, Jeffrey, threatening, to vacate Mike Johnson, were he to go down this road and enter into a bipartisan agreement with us. And so we did come to the conclusion that under normal circumstances, the chaos, the dysfunction, the extremism, the mess that you see on the other side of the aisle, y'all work it out on your own. We'll be here to govern responsibly, right? When you work through your dysfunction. But in that particular instance, where really the values, the rules-based society that had been built, led by America in the aftermath of World War II, were all at risk if Ukraine faltered. And we weren't there to support their righteous effort. And so we concluded that, if the extremists on the other side try to vacate Mike Johnson because he decides to do the right thing and enter into a bipartisan agreement with us to meet America's national security needs, that we're not going to let Marjorie Taylor Greene win when the objective is for America and the free world to win. And that's the conclusion that we drew.
Okay. But what's at stake now is not something as momentous as the future of the free world. It's continuing resolution. Obviously, it's important, keeping the government functioning, keeping the budget going. Doesn't sound like you're going to bring the same level of oomph to that effort that you made the last time. Is that fair?
It's fair to say that we evaluate these battles on a case-by-case basis. But I do think, you locking in on the moment that we're in terms of the government showdown is important because this is kind of like a Yogi Berra situation. He once made the observation, it's like deja vu all over again, right? Deja vu all over again. Only Yogi Berra, the great philosopher and baseball player, but government shutdowns are in the DNA of the Republican Party. And that is what we are confronting once again. If I made the observation recently on the House floor, to suggest that Republicans might really try to pull the trigger on shutting down the government is not hype, it's not hyperbole, it's not a hypothetical, it's historically grounded. If you go back to the 1990s, Newt Gingrich shuts the government down, and their extreme ransom demand at the time was that they wanted to end Medicaid as we know it. And they make these extreme ransom demands, and if you're unwilling to pay it, they shut the government down. And we're always going to stand on the side of the American people. So they shut the government down in the 1990s. Then in 2013, 14-day government shutdown. Tea Party forces John Boehner to do it. And the extreme ransom demand at the time was, we want the Democrats to agree to repeal President Obama's signature legislative accomplishment, right? The Affordable Care Act, which is benefiting tens of millions of people in a variety of ways. Thanks, but no thanks. So they shut the government down for 14 days. Then, about 5 or 6 years after that, in 2018, as you may recall, that was the beginning of the longest government shutdown in American history, 35-day government shutdown. And the ransom demand then was, we want taxpayers to fund Trump's ineffective medieval border wall, notwithstanding the fact that in 2016 he said Mexico was going to pay for it, right? No, we want taxpayers to spend billions of dollars to fund this medieval ineffective border wall, and if you don't do it, we're going to shut the government down, and that's what they did. Now, the irony of that particular government shutdown is that it began in December of 2018, and then it carried over into 2019. But in December of 2018, Donald Trump was the president. Republicans still controlled the House and the Senate. In other words, they shut themselves down. This is how much it's in their DNA. And so the extreme ransom demand right now is, if you don't agree to allow us to jam parts of Trump's Project 2025 agenda down the throats of the American people, we're going to shut the government down. And our view is that we will never, ever pay your extreme ransom demands. We will always defend the best interests of the American people.
I want to talk about cats and dogs for a minute, and electric sharks.
Yeah.
Famous dance from the 80s,
Right,
electric shark. So Trump is a 78-year-old man who incited a violent insurrection against the Capitol. He's a convicted felon. He's civilly adjudicated rapist. He spends much of his speeches, a great amount of time, insulting people, talking about pets being eaten, talking about whether it's better to be killed by a shark or by an electric battery, talking about windmills and how they cause bacon shortages. Why is this a toss-up?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a serious question.
Yeah.
What is going on in this country that is a toss-up? I'm not talking about her positive qualities or negative qualities, Kamala Harris. I'm just talking about, how do you explain this to yourself?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think obviously if this was a national popular vote election, Kamala Harris would clearly be on her way to winning. And she's going to win the popular vote and by millions. But the reality of the situation that we confront is, one, it's an electoral college dynamic, so it's going to come down to a handful of battleground states, some of which are, red-leaning states, like a North Carolina, traditionally Arizona, for instance, or certainly Georgia falls into that category. And it's just a narrow path for either party. And you've got a situation where there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. You have the Trump base, and then you have some misinformation built in on top of that. And you've got swing voters that don't necessarily pay attention to the day-to-day goings-on of what Trump may be saying or even what we may be saying, and lock in at the 11th hour. And then it becomes a question of how can you get them the accurate information.
But with all due respect,
Yeah.
I mean, it's still, even in a popular vote,
Yeah.
there's still, 48, 46, 47. I mean, it's not it's not a 60-40 thing.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, what could she be doing differently, or the Democrats be doing differently, that would highlight some of the obvious things, some of the obvious dynamics that I'm referring to?
Well, let me say that it is a closely divided America, and we can't run away from that fact. That's the reality of the situation. And Trump is the Republican nominee, just by default, has a significant number of Americans who are prepared to vote for him. And it's going to come down to how we move swing voters in our direction. I do think that if you take a step back, over the last few election cycles, 2022, 2023, the special elections that have occurred in 2024, that the Democratic brand is in a stronger position, and we've been winning races. Even in the 22 midterm election, we narrowly lost the House. But we narrowly lost the House in a context of high gas prices, high food prices, inflationary pressure, COVID fatigue, and lower presidential approval ratings than what I believe or deserved based on President Biden's accomplishments. But that spells red wave, if not red tsunami. And in past cycles, when you've had Democrats in complete control of the House, the Senate with the presidency, even with relatively popular Democratic presidents, for instance, Barack Obama, his first midterm election in 2010, House Democrats lost 63 seats. 63 seats. President Bill Clinton's first midterm election, Democrats had complete control of the House, the Senate, with Bill Clinton as president, 1994. We lost 54 House seats and the Senate at the same time. And so you look at the 2022 cycle, we narrowly lost the House, only lost it by 5 seats. 100 million people voted in the midterm elections in House races in 2022. You take the 5 closest races that we lost and add together the deficit, together it was 6,675 votes. So it was incredibly close. We didn't lose the Senate, we gained a seat in the Senate. We won all of the governorships in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, flipped the governorship in Arizona, held the governorships in places like New Mexico and Kansas. We were all concerned in 2022, of course, that extreme MAGA Republican election deniers who were running for Secretary of State and Attorney General would win in all of these battleground states. They all lost. And unlike 2010 or 1994, when we lost hundreds of state legislative seats, we actually won state legislative seats, including flipping both houses in Michigan and 1 house in Pennsylvania.
Let me ask you one more question about this, because the road to your speakership, strangely, might run through New York State. Nancy Pelosi blames Governor Hochul for losing some of those congressional races a couple of years ago. Do you agree with her? And what are you doing in New York to gain the speakership?
Yeah, so there's 16 districts that Republicans now hold. We only have to win 4, right? Net 4 to take back the House. 16 districts that Republicans now hold that President Biden won in 2020. So these are Democratic-leaning districts. 4 right now are in New York, 5 are in California. And so it's fair to say that we have to turn the situation around in both states. Now, we had a closer than expected governor's race in New York in 2022, but Kathy Hochul had just become the governor about 6 or so months, maybe a little sooner than that, but inside of a year, basically. And so, you know, she was put into a tough situation. She ran through the finish line. She did win. That was necessary. And she's been a great partner for us in rebuilding the state Democratic Party. We flipped a seat earlier this year in New York. It was a tough seat, but Tom Suozzi took our number from 5 to 4, 1 step closer to winning back control. And we've got other seats in New York that we have to win. And I believe that we'll continue to put the work in with Governor Hochul and Kirsten Gillibrand, who's been a great partner as well in terms of rebuilding the state Democratic Party. I'm confident New York is going to do what we need to do to make sure that on November 5th we take back the House.
Let me ask you one thing about that. Stipulating that the far right of the Republican Party causes more problems for Mike Johnson than the far left of your party causes for you. You are a moderate dispositionally and politically. How much of a threat to Democratic recapturing of the House, how much of a threat is the left wing of your party right now?
Well, you know, we've been proud of the fact that throughout the 118th Congress, you know, from the left and the center, the New Dems, the progressives, we have it all in the House Democratic Caucus, right? We have the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the New Dems, the Blue Dogs, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus, the Women's Caucus, the LGBTQ Equality Caucus, right? But we embrace that because we believe, consistent with what the House should be, we're the most authentic representatives of the American people and reflect the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears, the concerns, the anxieties, and the passions of the American people. And so I think we can have active, robust enthusiastic conversations about the best path forward, and I embrace that. But at the end of the day, what we've seen previously under the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, and we're trying to carry that forward, is that at the end of the day, we have to find the highest common denominator to make progress for the American people and deliver real results. And while that may leave some disappointed, understandably disappointed that perhaps we didn't go as far as some would have liked in a given policy area, that our history teaches us that we can always live to fight another day to continue America's march toward a more perfect union.
I have one final question for you, and it's the most serious question I think that you face or any leader of Congress faces right now. I want to know what specifically you're doing and how much time you're devoting to making sure that the Capitol and that the integrity of a legitimate election both are protected come January. The election is going to be close. Yeah. And if the past is a guide, Donald Trump, if he loses, is not going to accept that loss. What are you doing right now to make sure that we don't see that again?
Well, the first thing that was done, and this was incredibly important, was that the Biden administration, unlike the prior Trump administration, designated the January 6th certification as a national security event. So it will have the highest level of protection in terms of making sure you don't have a violent mob of insurrectionists trying to overturn the peaceful transfer of power, overrunning the Congress. And that's going to be an important distinction, that the planning, the engagement, the participation of law enforcement.
So if things go a certain way, we should expect the National Guard back in Washington.
Well, that's a possibility, and that decision will be made by the national security experts, by the law enforcement experts. What I would also say is that I think what is going to be very important is to make sure whoever is in the majority, right, because the new president is sworn in on January 20th. The Constitution requires the certification on January 6th. It also says the new Congress takes power on January 3rd. And so whoever has the gavels on January 3rd is going to determine, are we actually going to certify this election, or are we going to create chaos that perhaps throws the situation to the Supreme Court, and God help us in that particular scenario. And so our argument is we're going to work as hard as we can to partner with Vice President Harris and Coach Walz to make sure that they're elected. They're doing a tremendous job. Kamala Harris has hit the ground running in a phenomenal way. She's fighting for our future, our families, and our freedom. We want to make sure that Kamala Harris is the 47th president of the United States of America, and also make sure she has a governing partner by winning control of the United States House of Representatives.
And on that note, very cleanly done. Thank you very much, Leader Jeffries. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Please welcome the Atlantic's Alice McCown.
Let's give another round of applause for today's speakers and the Atlantic journalists for these incredible discussions. I'm Alice McCown, the publisher and Chief Revenue Officer of The Atlantic, and I'm delighted we're able to join us this morning. Our first day of the Atlantic Festival is just getting started. Stay with me for just a moment for a quick overview of the day ahead. At 11:30, across the way, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg will be speaking on the innovation stage. We'll also have a timely conversation about the mental health of today's youth on the culture stage. We'll see you back here at 3 p.m. for our afternoon session of the Ideas Stage, which will feature Senator John Fetterman, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and many more. Those are just a few highlights of the day's events. Check your festival agenda for the full schedule. Also, for more information about activating your Atlantic subscription or giving the Atlantic as a gift, please visit us at the information and check-in desks. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. Enjoy your festival experience, and I hope to see you at some of the sessions throughout the day.